and welcome to this video on Kamikaze, one of the poems from the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. So I've just put these pictures in really to get us started thinking about Kamikaze. As with the other videos, it's really important that you do read the poem before we start, and I'll put a copy of the poem up on screen for you to read, or you can look through it in the anthology. But these pictures are really helpful in just helping us to understand what this poem is about. So Kamikaze is a suicide pilot, particularly during the World War II, Japanese, essentially suicide bombers that were targeting mainly American boats in the Pacific Ocean. And so you can see one here, and they would fly their planes that would be full of missiles or explosives, and obviously, when the plane crashed, they would die with it. But in this story, the Kamikaze pilot, as he is driving over the blue-green, translucent blue-green sea, I think is the quotation from the poem, but he's driving over the, flying over the sea at sunrise, he decides not to carry on with his mission for whatever reason. And this poem is basically an exploration of what may have motivated him to change his mind. But quite a few times in the poem it says he must have done this or he must have done that, because essentially what he did was so taboo and so shameful that it's never spoken about. And then his daughter is sort of trying to imagine what might have changed his mind. Okay, so hopefully those pictures will help kind of trigger what this poem is about. So make sure you've got your copy of the poem and make sure you have got a highlighter and a pen. I've picked out some of the key quotations here, so you might want to pause and highlight them now, or you can highlight them when we go through the poem. I'm just going to show you that it does carry on onto this second slide here. So there's two more verses, okay? So if you need to skip back and read through the poem, make sure you read this one. So the 5 verses here, you might want to pause and do that now, but also read the 2 verses on the next slide. So I'm going to carry on from this point and just talk you through some of the notes on the other side. So literally what the poem is about, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's about a Japanese kamikaze pilot or a suicide bomber who goes to fight during World War II, and he decides to come back and not continue with his mission. And the poem suggests that one of the reasons why he might have decided not to continue with his mission is because of the beauty of the nature that he sees all around him. And then he has to subsequently deal with the shame that brings from society, because he doesn't, he's not a hero, he's not a martyr, he doesn't he's not supporting the country's cause. So that's what it's literally about. Let's have a look at the metaphorical meaning, the kind of deeper meanings. Really, this is a poem about the sort of expectations of our country or our culture or our family versus the personal experience or the individual. And that's what we see with this man, who is a father as well as a kamikaze pilot, and he decides to kind of follow his own heart, essentially, and that means not being a suicide bomber. It also looks at this internal conflict between these two roles that he's got on, and maybe the conflict between what it means to be human and kind of live up to our societal expectations, and also this idea of nature and maybe living more freely. So there's lots of ideas in this poem. A few things to be aware of to do with context. Obviously, we've got to understand what a kamikaze pilot is, and that is a very sort of Japanese, unique Japanese idea. You might have suicide bombers in other cultures and what have you, but the kamikaze pilot was specific to Japan. And it's important that we understand some things about Japanese culture as well. Particularly during this time, it was very patriotic and very honour-based. So people would want to be suicide bombers. They would volunteer for these suicide missions because it would bring the honour not just for themselves but for their family. They're not going to be around to see that honour, but they would be really revered and admired by society, and particularly that would bring honour for their family. If you didn't participate, then you might be shunned by society, as the man is, this kamikaze pilot in this poem. And Japanese culture really believed that it was better to die for your country than to be a coward. And it wasn't just about your own kind of decisions. It did bring then shame on the whole family if you didn't follow that through. So there's some important ideas that we need to know and understand in order to kind of understand what's going on in the poem. Let's get into having a look at each verse then. So, here's our first verse. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. So straight away here, we can see the idea that he's not planning on coming back. This is a one-way journey, and he's hoping to make history, to be a hero. I'm not going to read every verse to you, but just whilst we get started. So straight away, we've got this third-person narrative. So we've got the speaker in the poem who is telling us what has happened to this. I suppose she's a woman now, because there's a sort of suggestion that she's got her own children to her father. Okay. Now this is contrasted or juxtaposed with the title of the poem. So the title of the poem is Kamikaze, but then the first line of the poem, it says her father. So straight away we've got these two identities that are juxtaposing each other. We've got the father, and then we've got the kamikaze pilot. And this is his sort of two different identities. And the suggestion is here is that he can't fulfill both roles. You know, the kamikaze pilot is fulfilling the kind of expectations of society and becoming a hero. But to be a father, he needs to be present. He needs to be alive, and he needs to be there for his kids. So he can't do that if he's dead, essentially. So we've got a conflict and a contrast straight away. Remember that these poems are all part of the power and conflict cluster. And conflict doesn't necessarily need to be a war zone. We can have kind of a conflict of ideas as well. Next thing that's really interesting is this verb embarked. The first meaning of the word embark means to get on board something, so to get on board a plane or a boat. And he obviously does embark onto a plane, like you would when you go on holiday, because he gets on board that plane to fly into a ship. So there's military connotations here with the word embark. But embark also has another meaning, and it means to begin something new. I've put you an example there, like embarking on a new career. Okay, so in this sense, the word embark could symbolise that this kind of shift in him, or this realisation that causes him to refuse to fulfil his mission. So basically, he decides that actually, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. Which takes us nicely onto this next word, sunrise. You know, so this might be this sense of like hope or new beginning that makes him think, actually, no, I'm not going to do this. However, at this point in the poem, he's actually fully committed to being a suicide pilot. And this noun sunrise is really important because it's a really strong symbol of Japanese culture. Japan is often known as the land of the rising sun, and so the sunrise is a powerful cultural symbol. In the photos that we looked at the beginning, that's what you see him tying around his head, that headband with the red sort of sunrise on it. And so this could be like him, you know, the sort of, he's going to fly his plane towards the sun. That's like his target, almost like sort of, you know, going out beyond this earth, almost to the afterlife, to live a new life as a martyr. And then we get a list of the things he takes with him. A flask of water. Water is normally something we might associate with nature, and it reappears in the next verse, but in a different way. Whereas here it's in a flask, it's kind of contained. It's got a samurai sword, again a very strong symbol of power and violence, but also of culture. He's shaved his head, so again a very public cultural symbol. And his head is full of powerful incantations. Incantations is almost like another word for spells. So all these things here sort of, to me, have connotations of power. Shaved head suggests that he's powerful. He's got a sword that suggests he's powerful and violent. He's kind of controlling and restricting the amount of water that he's got. And these kind of objects here and the language being used here is really interesting in the way it contrasts with the next couple of verses. I also think this noun incantations is really important because the fact that the writer's chosen this word, and this is where we really start to think about effect. Maybe she's implying that the men were who chose to agree to be kamikaze pilots, she believes as a writer, were sort of brainwashed or bewitched in some way, which demonstrates the power of culture over men. And in this way, we can compare this poem to lots of the other poems, particularly sort of World War I poetry, where the soldiers felt that, they'd been kind of sold a myth, this kind of propaganda that had led them to go to war, and then the reality of it didn't really match up with their expectations. Make sure you have got the key notes down on those, certainly quotations in yellow as a minimum, but the one in blue would be really helpful as well. Pause the video here if you need to do that before we move on to the next verse. So with verse 2 we see a shift straight away because it starts with the word but. And we see here that the father changes his mind. Now we don't know because it says, but halfway there she thought he must have looked far down. So she doesn't know for definite that this is what changed his mind. And this is part of the beauty of this poem, that it's hearsay, it's not definite, because actually the shame that came with his refusal to kind of see through his mission was that it was never talked about. And there's a sense of kind of nostalgia or regret here that maybe she wishes she could ask him what really happened. And maybe he's dead now. We don't know. So we can see a change coming already because it says but halfway. So we know things are changing. Apologies, just finding my mouse. And she imagines that he must have looked far down out of the plane, that he was about to plough into an American boat, and sees these little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. So here the imagery is shifted from that very powerful, violent imagery of verse 1 to imagery to do with nature. The fishing boats are little, so we can talk about this adjective, how it makes life seem simple and sort of the boats almost seem vulnerable, I guess. And they are strung out like bunting. And this simile here is really interesting because on one hand, bunting is little flags. And maybe he's sort of surrendering, this kind of giving up or giving in and saying, no, I can't do this. But also bunting is often sort of strung out celebrations. So maybe he's sort of celebrating life and wants to live life. And even the sea is translucent, it's see-through, it's not holding him down. Nature here seems really free and harmless and has the power to override these powerful cultural expectations that he was willing to give his life for. And this carries on through verse 3, where in the water, in that sea, he sees beneath him, like a huge flag waved, these dark shoals of fishes that are swimming in a figure of 8 pattern. Now it's interesting these fish are a dark shoal and they're flashing silver, because this sight of nature, there does seem to be, I don't know why it says off there, it should say of, there seems to be a sort of darker side of life. But nature here is acting like a wake-up call, and it's breaking through those powerful incantations. So we've almost got a fight between nature and culture. And the way that these fish are described using the simile, like a huge flag waved, suggests that nature's waving its own warning flag to him. It's trying to get his attention and say, stop, what do you think you're doing? What on earth's going on here? So the fish appear like a big flag to him. And there's a few other key words to pick up here. These fish flash silver at him, and this word flashing might make us think of how his own life might flash before him, or his own death might be flashing before him. And then we've got this interesting sibilance here. Shoals, fish flash silver bellies swiveled towards the sun. Remember, the S doesn't have to be at the beginning of the word, but we've just got this repeated S sound. And with could be, remember, we can always sort of say that the S sound, this sibilance, is a soft, calming sound, like nature soothes him and brings him back. Or maybe this S sound, reminds him of the sort of bullets and the planes and the bombs whizzing past, and helps to bring him to this moment of clarity or realization where he decides that, actually, no, I don't want to die. And if we think of the sibilance as being the sound of bombs, this is kind of picked up as well with the idea of the fish flashing their silver bellies, almost like bullets or planes or bombs whizzing past. So we've got this kind of amalgamation, this mixture of military language and military ideas like the flag mixed in with nature, these two different ideas and slides coming together. Make sure you've got some of those key points down before you move on. Pause here if you need to. And in the next verse, it's still carrying on. It says "and" at the beginning. So remember, the daughter is still imagining what caused her father to turn that plane around and come home. And the other thing that she thinks may have been a real powerful driving force in deciding that he didn't want to die was that when he sees these fish in the water, he has a sort of flashback to a memory of him when he was young, waiting for his own father. So his brothers would have been on the beach, on the shore, building these kind of pebble towers called cairns, which people use to mark graves, by the way. So that might be an interesting idea to explore. But essentially, his brothers are waiting on the shoreline for his father's boat to return safely. And so she imagines, the daughter, that, as I say, her father's plane is flying out there, and he sees this shoal of fish, and then he starts thinking about when he had to wait for his father to return. So the idea here is that maybe the power of memory and the power of family is what manages to persuade him to change his mind. So again, we've got something else like nature that is overriding these cultural expectations, something much more personal here. And so maybe then the leap here is that as he remembers being a child, thinking about his own father's boat coming back safely, he then starts to think about his children. He's obviously, maybe snuck out of the house, to go and fulfill this mission, and maybe his children are going to be waiting for him to come home, thinking he's just gone to work. You don't know. So this is maybe what triggers him to start sort of thinking, actually, maybe my children are going to miss me. Maybe I need to return home. So there's nothing particularly to say about these words individually, although we'll look at the word safe actually in a sec, because it's repeated in the next verse. But the idea with this verse particularly is introducing this idea of the power of memory, the power of family. And then in the next verse we see this word safe repeated. Now the way I imagine this is she's telling this story to someone, and the writer, and again we'll look at this in a sec, uses italics a bit like you would use speech marks. So she's telling this story. I'll just flick back to the last slide about her father's boat. And then it's sort of almost like she says, yes, my grandfather. So this is like her own words, or she's telling the story to someone else, in her family. Yes, it was grandfather's boat. So that's why we've got this bit in italics, but don't worry too much about that. Remember, we can't write about everything in these poems. We just need to pick these two quotations. And you'll have noticed, or you may not have noticed, that we've got lots of enjambement in this poem. The first full stop out of all these verses appears in this verse here. So it's interesting here that the use of enjambement, because it's not the end of the sentence, but the word safe is really reinforced and highlighted, not just through the repetition, but because it's on its own at the end of this line. And this idea that he needs to return safely, he cannot fulfill this mission and essentially kill himself because he needs to be alive to fulfill his role as a father and return safely to his children. And whilst he's sort of having this realization, he remembers his father, who must have been a fisherman, coming back with all these different fish on his boat: cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, loose silver of whitebait, and a tuna. And the boat itself is full of life, and the grandfather is providing here, providing all this food for his family. And so this image of life and of fatherhood and of nature and of living creatures really is what reinforces the father's desire to live. So you can see in this poem, it's not sort of specific words that you can talk about, but how they the ideas and the images in the poem that the writer picks and crafts help to collectively build this sort of sense of idea and the ideas in the poem. Make sure you've got those key ideas down then about certainly the word safe, and if you can get those ideas down about the list as well, that's really going to help you push for some of those high grades, 6 and above. Now this is where we get to a really key point. These are the last 2 verses, and you'll notice here that the writer has shifted to italics. That's not me just making a typo, that's how it is printed in the anthology. And this is a real key volta, turning point, or a shift. The italics here signify a kind of shift to first person. So whereas before it's been third person, as if someone was listening in and recounting the story, the daughter now gives us her exact words. And she tells us that her mother, my mother, never spoke again in his presence. So she was so ashamed by her husband's kind of unwillingness to carry out this mission and become a suicide pilot that she basically stopped speaking. And this is obviously a really personal memory that the speaker in the poem is sharing with us. So we're hearing her exact words, and this shift to first person creates a real sense of intimacy here. We're hearing her voice directly, and this might show how deeply she was affected by the way everyone turned against her father, because if you read on in this verse, it wasn't just her mother. It says, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. And you can actually sort of really hear her disbelief in the tone in her voice. And at the time, she was obviously still a child. She says, only we children still chattered and laughed. So this is this idea that she is now remembering, how everybody reacted when her father returned. Remember, she's never spoken to her father about this. She just says, oh, he must have thought this or he must have thought that. Now, it's ironic that everyone treats him like this because her father made a decision to live, and yet everyone chooses to act like he is not there. And there's almost a suggestion in this poem that it would have been better if he had died, because he would have become a martyr and he would have been honoured by the family and by the neighbours. And the children at this stage are a bit ignorant and oblivious to it. They just carry on. We still chattered and laughed. And these verbs here, chattered, laughed, and really suggest the ignorance and the innocence of children. But as we go into the final verse, we see this is lost as well too. Again, reinforcing this kind of battle between the individual and the choices that the father makes and the power of nature. So remember, it was his own memory, or potentially his own memory of his own father as a child, that maybe helped to change his mind. But his own children, it says, or the daughter says, we too learned to be silent. And this is a really important quote here, because we've got perhaps a sense that she feels ashamed now as an adult of how she treated her father. And remember, it said, and the neighbours too, in the last verse, and now we've got we too. So this kind of cultural expectation that they're going to shun and shame him spreads firstly from his wife or the mother to the neighbours and then to the children, who in the previous verse were very innocent. Remember, they were still chattering and laughing. And we get this idea of that this was a learned behaviour. And the writer's trying to point out that these kind of cultural expectations are learned. And they can be negative behaviours like this one, turning your back on your own father because he wouldn't kill himself for his country, as well as maybe more positive associations that we have with our different cultures. So this is a really important line here. And she says, that this was no longer the father we loved. It's almost like they've got to pretend that he's someone that he's not. And then at the end she says, and sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Now we're not in italics anymore, so it's still the daughter's voice. This bit here is just the end of her kind of direct quote. And now again, we're going back to the sort of speaker reporting what the daughter's saying. He must have wondered. Again, we don't know for definite. We've got this sense of uncertainty. And this language here, this tentative language, really reinforces the sense that there's a barrier between father and daughter, that she couldn't talk to him about it because the subject was taboo. And here's a really nice word to use here. She seems wistful, the speaker at this point. And wistful means kind of reflective and thoughtful, also a bit nostalgic, that she's maybe regretting that she didn't broach these conversations with her father. Maybe it's too late now. Maybe he's dead. And she says he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Which had been the better way to die, suggests that he did feel that he was metaphorically dead when he returned because no one would speak to him. And really what's being suggested here is that this metaphorical death was maybe longer and slower and more painful because of the way he was treated, cut off from his family and society, almost, sort of a humiliation going on here. Whereas if he had fulfilled his mission, he would have had a hero's death, and his death would have been short and quick. Now this is again another sense of irony here, okay? When he decides to no longer be a suicide bomber, well, ultimately, because of culture's expectations, he's dead to society anyway at that point. And let's just notice that the very last word in the poem is die. And this again means the poem has a very kind of sad, futile ending. Remember, futile means pointless. We've looked at that with quite a few of the other poems. Almost like this was his fate to die. He was destined to die, and he's not been able, even in choosing to live, he's not been able to escape this death. So whilst this poem has lots of positive moments where it's kind of celebrating nature and the power of family, it's also really bittersweet at the end because the cultural expectations kind of trump and then override. He manages to override culture by deciding not to fulfill the Kamikaze mission, but then culture gets the better of him when he comes back. Okay, make sure you've paused the video at all those key points and got all of these ideas down. Let's just have a look at structure and some of the other key things. So again, before we do that, I'm just going to leave these pictures on the screen. You might just practice using these pictures to trigger writing about the poem, or see if you can now use these pictures just to help you cement your understanding of this poem better. So again, we've got this headband here, maybe symbolising the line, his father embarked at sunrise, or here, green-blue translucent sea. Let's have a look at structure then. So hopefully you've got a copy of the poem in front of you so you can look at this at the same time. You'll notice that each verse has 6 lines, and generally the lines are of a similar length. We haven't got lines that are kind of really sticking out or some that are much shorter. So what are we going to say about this? Then we might say then that the effect of this is that the writer has chosen to use a tight control of structure, and this could reflect the order and obedience expected both by the military in terms of being a kamikaze pilot, but also the Japanese society and cultural expectations. So we've got this sense of restriction and obedience going on, reflected by the structure of the poem. Now, we've also got a contrast though, because there's no rhyme in the poem, and as we said, there's lots of enjambment where the sentence carries on over more than one line. We haven't got a full stop, I think, until verse 5. So what could the free verse, the lack of rhyme and the enjambment signify? Well, we could say then that represents the father's attempts to break free from society's expectations. All right, so we've got two very different ideas, one suggesting control, one suggesting freedom. And because these ideas kind of juxtapose each other, it might be worth looking at, well, why use two contrasting structural techniques? Why might that be relevant to the poem? And we've got a couple of ideas here. Maybe this contrast could represent or mimic the conflict between man as an individual and his family and culture. So the family and culture are the restriction, the tight verse structure, and the freedom of the man as the individual could represent the lack of rhyme and the free verse and the limited punctuation. Or we could say we've got the conflict between that kind of cultural pride and commitment to that culture, or his desire to live a life of freedom. It's the same idea, but just expressed differently. And the same here. Could say that the tight verse structure symbolises the military and society and culture that are imposing this kind of control, and then the free verse and the enjambment symbolises nature and the freedom of the individual to make choices and have control of their own life. So remember, it's never important enough just to talk about describing the structure. It's really important to make sure you think about the effect of that structure. All right, and we can pre-learn all of this so we can say it in the exam. Make sure you've got those notes down on structure somewhere then on your copy of the poem. So let's keep moving on then. We've got your notes down on structure. What are the writer's ideas here? All things that we've already talked about as we've gone through annotating the poem. So we've got these national, cultural and family expectations versus the personal experience. We've got the internal conflict between those different roles, and that the man is taking on the role of the father versus the role of the soldier. We've got the conflict between nature and humanity. We have got the conflict between, or the power of society and the power of culture to change our behaviour and to motivate us. The power of family to bring him back, the power of nature to bring him back, and that strong identity that he feels as a father, and essentially his identity as a father and also his identity as a son when he remembers his own father is what trumps and overrides his identity as a kamikaze pilot. We've got the idea of nature as something that's free, and the idea of life being something that should be celebrated. And really, again, the poet is trying to explore what motivates an individual to act in certain ways. So why did the man become a kamikaze pilot at the beginning anyway? And why does he then choose not to become a kamikaze pilot? Make sure you've got those noted down somewhere so that we can really talk about what the writer is trying to achieve with this poem, rather than just talking about what the poem is about. A few key points there in terms of themes then. How can we link this poem to different themes to do with power? How can we link it to different themes to do with conflict? And also just thinking about just some of the poems that you might want to link it to. So it links with London because we've got this kind of conflict between society and individual, just like we have in London. The power of nature, so it links with Prelude. Poppies, for example, because it's looking at the impact of war on other people, not just on soldiers. And the idea of identity being really important, so maybe linking it with checking out my history there. But they're just a few suggestions. You've got 8 quotations there, which are the ones that you really need to try and learn for this poem. Make flashcards with them, test yourself on them, have a go at writing them down now. And what would you say about each one, for example? And again, you've got a list of prompts there. Can you use those prompts to help you remember some of the key points from the poem? And then the last thing, and I would like you all to complete this, is you've got 10 questions there on the poem. So take a picture of that or pause it and have a go at answering those 10 questions now. As with all the videos, you can go back and pause and catch up on anything that you've missed. So hopefully you've been able to work through that at your own pace. Make sure you've got those questions down to consolidate your understanding. And as always, there's just a reminder of some of the ways that you can revise each poem as you come to them. Hope you found this video helpful, and just make sure that you get through all the poems as soon as you can. Thanks.